Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's Falconer Natural History Lectures from the University at Albany's Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. Tonight's presentation is Electric Bikes, Bikeshare, and More. This is the third Falconer lecture in our Spring 2021 series. My name is Mark Boharnwa. I am your meeting host this evening and will be reviewing the lecture protocols and introducing tonight's lecture host. The Zoom protocols for tonight's lecture are as follows. The lecture, all messages sent to the Zoom chat feature, and the post-lecture Q&A are being recorded. All participant video and audio has been disabled until the post-lecture Q&A period. However, you may submit comments or questions to the chat at any time. Anything requiring clarification from the speaker will be addressed during the lecture. All other comments or questions will be addressed during the post-lecture Q&A session. Please do not use the Zoom raise your hand feature until the post-lecture Q&A period. Any raised hands will be addressed in the order they were received, and you will be asked to unmute to pose your question. You may also enable your video if you so choose. Please remember that if you are going to ask a question, to make sure your background noise is at a minimum. Tonight's lecture host is Dr. Richard Perez, Senior Research Associate at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. Dr. Perez will introduce tonight's speaker and will moderate the post-lecture question and answer period. Dr. Perez.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Paul Winkeller tonight. Paul most recently served as a board president and then executive director of the New York Bicycling Coalition, a 30-year-old statewide organization whose mission is to get every New Yorker on a bicycle for whatever reason: transportation, recreation, tourism, economic development, health, fitness, and fun. Paul began his career as a very young political appointee in Washington in the Interior Department during the Jimmy Carter administration. His career reflects high-level experience in both the public sector at all levels, local, state, and federal government, as well as private sector, both not-for-profit and for-profit, and in many program areas, mostly with a conservation and sustainability focus. In addition to the State Bicycle Coalition, Paul has been executive director of District Community Gardens, predecessors of Capitol Roots, executive director of the Albany Service Corps, a youth conservation corps funded by AmeriCorps, executive director of the Capital Region chapter of Physicians for a National Health Program, and has served on numerous boards and organizations, both local, statewide, and national, including the Honest Weight Food Co-op in Albany, which is where I met Paul a couple years ago, and that led to his presentation tonight. So, Paul, I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say about bikes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate you're setting this up. I'm really grateful to SUNY and the Atmospheric Science Research Center for tolerating a discussion of bicycling. I'm going to date myself a little bit. When I moved up here in 1980, I remember Ray Falconer on WAMC, and I remember him as being incredibly charming and smart. I don't remember what he talked about all the time, but it was great. So I'm going to speak for about a half hour. I'm going to go from a big picture to maybe a bit smaller. I'm now affiliated with a small boutique planning firm based in New York City. You can check it out on our website, in particular the projects we're working on. We're trying to straddle a line between planning, engineering, and advocacy, which is a little bit unusual and a rather difficult tightrope to walk in a very political state like New York. I'm going to date myself again here. A book that had a profound influence on me when I was studying economics as an undergraduate at Vassar in Poughkeepsie was E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. economics as if people mattered. That book really rocked the boat when it came out because it really sort of flipped the paradigm against growth and largeness. I put up this slide because small scale, in particular small scale mobility, is beautiful. Now, it's an interesting slide because visually it frames complete streets work, which is the heart of the work that I do and have done for the last 5 years, which is about the most efficient use of existing public space. And the question in looking at this slide really is how do we as planners, engineers, and thought leaders achieve the highest and best use of streets, which are public space, particularly in a transportation system like ours, which is designed for and it's still dominated by cars. The slide depicts various modes of moving 40 people around, walking, cycling, in a bus, and in cars. And while we might prefer small is beautiful, which is biking and walking, the real challenge that this slide tries to articulate is how do we accommodate all modes, all transportation modes to create a more equitable and transportation system. So again, I'm going to focus on the big picture quickly. The League of American Bicyclists, which used to be the League of American Wheelmen, which was not a very politically correct name, was founded in the 1890s when bicycling actually was a dominant mode in many cities. LAB rates every state. With a report card, you could see some of the criteria on the right. Well, I was at NYBC, and I don't take any credit for this at all, or my staff. Our ranking, mostly because we bugged New York State about what a lousy job they did filling this out every year. The rank rose to 13 from 42. As we'll see in the next few slides, there has been a substantial investment in bike infrastructure in New York State. But when it comes to bike safety education, law enforcement education, with regards to bike and pedestrian safety and statewide bicycle master planning, and a whole other host of features, the state really lags. And I think that 13 rank is rather generous. I can elaborate on this topic ad nauseum later or off this thread. But one other interesting thing about this slide, and you can go to the LAP's website and you can blow it up and read it. One thing about New York State that's also lacking is we don't have any data. We don't know how many people ride bikes. We don't know their race, their gender, their age, their economic status, nothing. Those kind of statistics are not tracked, either in the national census or in a periodic transportation census that some states run. We don't know the value of bike-based tourism, which is it's exploding economic development activity in upstate New York and Hudson Valley. We don't even know how much the state spends each year by region on maintaining on and off-road bike infrastructure. It's really difficult to have enlightened public policy without data. That's a real problem. So just big picture stuff. Again, it's easy to spend money, I guess. And New York State has spent some substantial amount of money on the shared use path, for example, on the Mario Cuomo Bridge. I was not allowed to say this when I ran the State Bike Coalition because some of our funding was from the state, but if you divide the price of that bridge by the, if you measure the width of that bridge and divide the cost of it by the width of that multi-use bike path, I would put money that's the most expensive bike path in the world. I couldn't say that because I was told you'd never get any money for biking again if you'd said that in public. That bump out there, it's a kind of a nice jaunt to take. It's noisy and windy, but there are 6 different bump outs, and that one on the lower right is looking at the Palisades. It's really quite a gorgeous view. Another big money deal, a couple of years ago, governor announced $200 million allocated to create the Empire State Trail. It's completed. It's a rebranding of the route along the old Erie Canalway, going west to east, or east to west from Albany. Finished a lot of very difficult portions of that, which had laid, which were a real barrier for years, and also created a north-south corridor from New York City to Plattsburgh. The northern part, north of Albany, is mostly on road and it's not very charming. There's some really neat features in the Hudson Valley. I've ridden everything the last year. For those of you who ride, the electric trail from Hudson to Rensselaer is quite wonderful. So again, a lot of money, 200 million bucks. Again, another sort of future thing that I think is going to happen that I'm actually still working on. When the governor announced the Empire State Trail, my phone rang off the hook from Long Island politicians and Long Island bike advocates saying, what about us? How can you have a statewide trail without Long Island? So there will be, I believe, a Long Island Greenway, and we're in the midst of a multi-phase conceptual and design study of that. Again, there's a lot of people on Long Island. It's possible, it's difficult. It's going to use some utility corridors. Another thing, again, a money thing, and I'm sure everybody in this call has seen it in their travels all over the state. There's a whole lot more protected bike lane, various kinds of protected bike lanes. These are both cycle tracks, which mean they go in, they're going both directions. I think both of these are in Western New York. One's in Niagara and one in Buffalo. And then again, this is a really smart use of that public space. And they're not just in New York City. New York City has really led in terms of the build out of protected bike lanes. Last year when I put this talk together, I was going to talk a whole lot more about e-bikes. E-bikes are a game changer. E-bikes are the only part of, according to the People for Bikes, National Bike Industry, the only segment of bike sales that is going up every year are e-bikes. And that kind of mirrors what has been going on for years in Europe, where e-bikes are the top sellers. E-bikes legislation, a 3-class system. Again, you can look this up on People for Bikes. Several dozen states have passed similar legislation establishing a 3-class system of e-bikes. Class 1 is pedal assist. You get no power if you don't pedal. Class 2 has a throttle. Class 3 is a pedal assist and goes 28 miles an hour. E-bike legislation passed because bike industry lobbyists put a ton of money 2 years ago into this. This legislation sat idle for years. E-bikes are a wonderful thing because they expand the universe of people that can ride a bike, both people who are physically not able or strong enough, and also people that don't want to own a car or can't own a car and need an alternative form of transportation. There are a lot of equity issues around e-bikes, particularly when they're deployed in major cities where parts of some cities are not served well by mass transit. People can use e-bikes to get to work at odd hours and odd jobs. I can talk more about e-bikes if someone wants to ask some questions. Again, Bikeshare has also exploded in New York State. Dirty secret about Bikeshare, which I didn't really know for a long time. I just thought the Bikeshare companies were all bike advocates and really well-intentioned. Bikeshare collects data, and data is sold to vendors to market stuff. So they're a good thing as a transportation alternative, but there are ulterior motives around these things. And to my point earlier, Bike share is the only kind of biking that is quantified. We do know how many people are using e-bikes because they've all got chips. They're all connected to a system that keeps track of where they are and how many miles to put on them. There are bike share programs, obviously a huge one in New York, but that's Capital Region Bike Share, which is sponsored by CDPHP on the right. Bike share has both a dockless version and which basically you can drop the bike anywhere when you're done with it. And then there's a dock system, like as in the city bike picture. E-bike, also some systems have an e-bike option, not just fully human powered. So again, bike share programs are absolutely exploding. Some of the companies are now making money. And again, adding that electric option really fosters a whole different category of bike activity. I'm going to pivot now and run through a series of slides because I am talking to a SUNY-sponsored audience. And we have done presentations to college community, to the Center for Independent CICU, Center for Independent College Universities. We have done some presentations about adapting colleges and universities for more and better cycling. And I thought I would include this next set of slides because it helps to frame a lot of the issues around complete streets and mass transit integration. College campuses are ideal incubators for innovation with regard to transportation choices. So I'm going to run through some of these slides. Again, they illustrate many of the current issues and challenges with regard to bicycling, complete streets, and transportation choices as they impact all facets of the environment. Some of this stuff's pretty obvious to us. The importance of campus mobility. I think it's kind of interesting, the last bullet, for many students. And New York State has more private universities than any state in the country. I didn't know that either. I think Massachusetts is second, and Pennsylvania's third, and California's fourth, I think. But you know, for students, college is the first exposure to independent mobility and freedom. And in presenting other options like bicycling and walking and mass transit, at that point in a young person's life can really frame mobility choices and behavior as a person moves into adulthood. One of the pitches to the universities is biking is fun. The same organization, the League of American Bicyclists, has a bike-friendly university program. It's not a very hard application to fill out. I filled out a few of them for universities in the past. Given the coolness of cycling now and the fact that it's a safe, socially distant way to get around, you know, we would argue that bike-friendly campuses can attract students, good places to live and learn. Obviously, this is a slide that relates not just to universities, but the past year. Again, there's no data, it's anecdotal. But given that you can't buy a new bike, unless you want to buy a custom bike, bike shops closed last year. Many bike shops in the summer took a pause because they couldn't get parts to repair bikes that people had taken out of the garages and basement. We know there's a lot more biking. I see a lot more biking. I put on 4,500 miles, which is twice what I usually do last year. There's a lot of bicycling. It's a healthy, socially distant activity. But in terms of a campus, the social distancing has led to declining transit ridership and the general public as well, along with more biking and more driving. There are obviously inequities and increased driving. Pretty self-explanatory. The congestion, pollution, and climate change part is another theme that universities seem to be very responsive to. They're important to their students and their faculty. So COVID had created a bit of a conundrum the last year with campuses. Certainly has slowed down our dialogue with campuses trying to figure out how to open or stay open, or how long to be open, or what their protocols are about testing. So again, it's been increased congestion, less demand for, on-campus shuttle service, demand for more car parking. There's also been an increased demand for bicycle parking. And we don't do that well with bicycle parking in this country. So again, some sort of, these 5 points of preaching to the converted probably in this call, but these are points that are not always apparent to campus plant managers we've spoken to, who don't think about their campus as kind of a system of moving people and students and visitors around. So one thing we talk about with campuses is how to evaluate where they're at in terms of cycling and walking and multimodality. And again, some of this is, sure people have heard about the various E's when it comes to evaluating transitions to accommodating different modes of engineering. Again, we would try to work with a campus to do this kind of evaluation. What is in place? Is there a network of trails and bike lanes? Is there bike parking? Is there enough bike parking? And again, this is the kind of protocol that we use in work that we do in all different contexts, especially our complete streets workshops around the state of New York. Again, some kind of evaluation metric, try to fit into the dialogue. Enforcement, I could really talk someone's ear off about enforcement, which is really not so much in a campus environment, but enforcement of safe biking and walking in New York State is a disgrace, in my opinion. Cops aren't trained. They don't really care about bike safety that much. There's not much time spent in training academies on the V&T laws, the vehicular and traffic laws relating to bike and pedestrian safety. There's no retraining or ongoing training. I've presented to police departments, including New York City, and I've been told in my face, we don't really care about bike safety. It's not that important. I think the law enforcement community has not been on top of that. Education empowerment is another one of those E's. Most campus, it's easy to access this information online from different organizations. But again, if we want to encourage students to bike, there needs to be some kind of safety education, hopefully some kind of workshop, either on campus or near campus. While there's student bike groups, there is actually at my alma mater at Vassar, there's actually a bike recycling program in Poughkeepsie. So again, just some campus design solutions that again, they apply to almost any context, not just campuses. This slide's another way to emphasize the importance of education, both for potential users of an expanded campus transportation system, as well as the general public coming in and out of the campus. Better wayfinding enables students to connect to their local communities, engage in economic development and other activities, and more biking and walking lessens the impact on transportation infrastructure in a college host community. Again, these are just some little things that are part of planning for a more comprehensive transportation environment. Proceeding, maintaining socially distance. Sidewalk extensions are interesting. what you notice with both these concepts is a shift toward keeping the sidewalk clear for through traffic and allocating road space for pedestrians and other users. Traffic calming, slow through streets. A lot of campuses are already doing this, and this is an ideal way for a campus and really any other organization interested in redoing their transportation network to sort of control the local streetscape environment. Campus transit, we have, I think, really some great expertise. And if you go to our website, you'll see a national manual sponsored by the American Public Transit Association that we did based upon interviewing 30 transit agencies around the country, where we came up with best practices about integrating bicycling into mass transit. So again, these are things that Europe has thought about longer than we have in our especially Northern Europe. But they're coming here. Bike parking, again, the variety of options is, particularly nowadays, there never seems to be enough bike parking. Bike share, I talked about a little bit. There is some bike share on campuses. And that, again, is an option we've talked about with one campus in particular. Messaging and communication is another important area. There are, if you go to the New York Bicycle Coalition's website, there's a list of recycled bike programs around the state. I think there's about a dozen, including Albany, Troy Bike Rescue, Albany Recycle a Bike, and Electric City Bike Rescue in Schenectady. This again is an ideal campus service project. There's actually one on the Vassar campus. It's pretty good. Again, you want to get students and anyone else to bike, you've got to incentivize security. And there's some great technology out there, not just locks, but there's software that can help protect bicycles. And then just that other E, the encouragement, the general promotion of biking. There are, again, ways on campus and in the community. I know that in Brooklyn, there's an HMO that actually provides some of its clients, or used to, a pass on City Bike Share to get them moving. So, they may actually do that here in the Capital Region. It's CDPHB sponsors Capital Bike Share, but creative ways of getting people on bikes. Forward. Again, this sort of sums up some of our work with campuses. I just discussed, I think, almost all this. And there I am. If anybody has questions they want to get in touch, I'm happy to entertain any and all questions, both by email and also on this call right now. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Sure.